Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Garrell, and thank you for participating in today's 202nd Justice Clearinghouse webinar entitled Social Network Analysis, an Innovative Tool to Maximize NIBIN Leads. This webinar has been sponsored by Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology, who is dedicated to educating justice personnel around the world about developing effective crime gun intelligence programs. They are a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, also known as IBIS. IBIS is designed to find the needle in the haystack by discovering matches between pairs of spent bullets and cartridge cases at speeds well beyond human capacity. Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology helps experts obtain timely information so they can make society a safer place. Now, this webinar will examine how social network analysis can be applied to criminal justice data to better understand the small world of violence. Our presenters will explain how we can first use NIBIN leads to get a picture of how violence incidents are connected through a common firearm. Next, we can then link incident data to the individuals involved in those crimes. And by aggregating crime incident data with NIBIN, we can get to a point of seeing the network of people associated with violence in a jurisdiction. Now, our first presenter for today is Andrew Fox, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at California State University in Fresno. He received his PhD from Arizona State University in criminology and criminal justice. His research interests include social network analysis, gangs, crime prevention, and communities. Our second presenter is Dan Carew, who is a deputy prosecuting attorney with the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office in Seattle, Washington. He is currently assigned to the Crime Strategies Unit, which focuses on data-driven approaches to reducing firearms violence. Dan has worked extensively with NIBIN and social network analysis and sees both as critical components of the county's violence prevention efforts. And the last few things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, the event is being recorded and is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It will be available to Justice Clearinghouse subscribers on the website early tomorrow. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll address as many as possible at the conclusion of this presentation. Third, you may have noticed on the GoToWebinar toolbar, we have made the presentation materials available as a handout. You can click on the SNA NIBIN Justice Clearing.pdf file and have that available for you during the webinar and of course after. And then finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps us shape our future schedule of events. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn our presentation over to our presenters. Andrew, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And thank you all for taking some time out today to join this webinar and hear about some of the analysis and work that we're doing up in King County, Washington. The idea behind this presentation or this analysis came, and we're really at the beginning of it, right? We're attempting to combine NIBIN data with social network analysis data with GIS, geographic analysis. And our hope is that, I know that there's a lot of some agencies on this webinar that are doing a lot with network analysis, and I'm excited to see what they'll do moving forward with SNA. And so I think we're still at the beginning points of learning how these data can be used and inform our programs. Specifically, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Pasco County, Kansas City are all doing some really cool stuff with social network analysis, and I hope this is a jumping point in pushing us all forward. Before I get started, I want to recognize Lexi Gill. She's a graduate student who conducted a lot of this analysis up in King County and Seattle, and did an incredible job, and I'm very, very thankful for the work she's done. So first, what is social network analysis? So social network analysis is the analysis of relationships. We do a pretty good job within the criminal justice system of looking at individual attributes, right? We can look people up and understand where they've committed crime, something about their known addresses and stuff like this, right? If they're wanted. but we don't do a very good job of managing and analyzing the relationships between people. And so social network analysis gives us a tool to kind of move beyond these individual attributes and understand how things are connected, right? Guns, drugs, information flows between people from person to person. And so if we're going to effectively intervene in these types of, in this case, violent networks, we need to understand how those relationships are structured and how the information, or how the, in this case, guns, might be flowing between people, and how we can focus our resources and energy in the right place. Social network analysis gives us some tools to understand the structures of these networks, which could inform potential strategies that could work or be most effective. It also helps us identify individuals who are in influential positions. People in networks are not all in equal spots or positions within a network. Some people are more central than others. That's not to say that network position, and I'll probably say this a few times, network position is not the same as criminality, right? Just because you're an influential person doesn't mean you're the most criminal. But our goal here is to understand the social dynamics related to violent crime, to inform our strategies and our interventions to hopefully reduce violent crime in our cities. Next slide. Social network analysis, what it's not, right? Some people, the term, I get this a lot, so I say this a lot, that social network analysis is not social media analysis. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these are all social media platforms. And we could use our social network analysis techniques to analyze social media. This has been done and is a big field, but specifically, we're not talking about analyzing social media data. We're analyzing criminal justice data, crime incident data, NIBIN, which is forensic evidence of the gun. And so don't get those things confused or mixed up. It's also different than link analysis, right? Many people use some type of link analysis software, Analyst Notebook, or something like that. And in those cases, you have people, guns, addresses, cars, all connected to each other in some kind of link diagram or link chart. The social network analysis and link analysis are related, right? They're all looking at the relationships between things. But in social network analysis, our goal ultimately, and by the end of some of this analysis, you'll see, is to look at the relationship, one-to-one relationships between people. Right? How are individuals connected to other individuals, and why does that matter for the work we're doing? It also gives us some tools to lay out our data. There's so much information that we're collecting about crime. And we need software and systems to organize that information so that we can understand what it's telling us. And so social network analysis provides some different layout optimization options to organize that information so that we can see these patterns that might exist. It also tells us different positions. There's some different ideas of why might someone be important within this network. Why, or what are some of the different definitions of centrality that makes someone influential within a network? And that's different than link analysis. We're looking at kind of network position. In link analysis, too, the analyst has a lot of control over what's in the middle and where things belong, right? You might build a link chart around someone or a specific case. In social network analysis, we're letting kind of the patterns in the data identify, based on different definitions, who's most central or might hold the keys to the flow of information or goods or drugs within this network. Next slide. So just some terminology and to kind of get a basis, you're going to see a lot of pictures of dots and lines as we talk through some of these networks. These networks we call network pictures, we call sociograms, and they consist of these dots and lines. Right, each dot we call a node or an actor. It's really whatever we're looking at or examining. Most of the time, by the end of these will be people. But you'll see some what we call two-mode networks. Two-mode network includes both the incidents and the people involved, and so you'll see two different colored dots that represent those two different types of information. These dots are connected through ties, and there's lots of different ways that people could be tied together, right? You could have a familial connection, an employment connection, a criminal, and what we're looking at is co-offenders, right? People who are connected to each other because they were arrested or suspects on a crime together, and so we know that there's a connection between them because they've committed a crime together. And so you'll see lots of these different sociograms. I'll try to describe what the dots and lines mean for each one. Next slide. The data, this is not the data we're using in our current analysis, but potential data that agencies could use to conduct network analysis. The idea here is that every agency has network data, could be using network analysis on the data they already have. It's anything report that links people together, right? We could have a field interview knowing that two people were at the same place at the same time. Arrest reports, right? Connections between people who are arrested together. Gang intel reports. And important for us now, I think, probably one of the most underused types of network data that we have available to us within the criminal justice system is NIBIN data. The ability to link cases together through a common weapon. Next slide. So this is a current analysis, right? We've kind of had this idea with all of these different tools that tell us something about violent crime. And finally, we're able to get all that data together to conduct this analysis. I want to mention that the hardest part, I think, of this type of analysis is bringing together different data sets. We store data in different places, our RMS system, and getting all of that data together is a challenge, and then cleaning it and putting it together. In the current analysis, we use data from 7 different agencies, right? And law enforcement agencies aren't using the same RMS system, and so we have to export that data, combine it, and then clean it together. And so that's a big challenge here, is getting these kind of different types of information and bringing them together. So in this analysis, the first thing that we're doing is fully understanding the NIBIN leads that exist, and I'll get into some of those definitions here in a second, but all the NIBIN leads and the incidents that they're connecting together. So first, let's get control of that information and see the networks that exist. After that, each one of those incidents that are connected by NIBIN has people associated, right? There are people who are arrested for those crimes, and there are also suspects in those crimes that we could start to link together. But the rabbit hole continues, right? Those people who were arrested for a shooting also engaged in other types of crime. Right? We talk about offenders being cafeteria-style offenders, right? Where they're engaged in a little bit of everything. And so we can pull in that information, the other incidents that people were involved in. And in those non-NIBIN incidents that they've engaged in, they have co-offenders. And so we can pull in that information. And so we what I like to describe it as building the rabbit hole all at once. So we can understand how all of our crime data, including NIBIN, is all connected to each other in one network. And then finally, after we talk about some of the analysis, we're going to discuss some of the roles the prosecutors play in using this information for both prevention and intervention efforts. Next slide. Some basic information or terms that we'll make sure everyone understands before we move forward. We're talking a lot about NIBIN. NIBIN is a ATF program that gives us the ability to link cases together, incidents, shooting incidents most likely, based on a common weapon. And we identify the common weapon based on the imprint on the back of a spent cartridge. There are nearly 200 sites in the US that are processing these casings for NIBIN and over 6,000 law enforcement agencies, right? And so we think about it, this is network data. Incidents can have a relationship with each other because the same gun was present or used at those incidents. And so that's why I think NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, is an incredibly valuable network tool to understand this small world of violence that exists within many of our jurisdictions. Next slide. Some terms. So IBIS is the technology that's used to correlate the image on the back of the casing. NIBIN is the program that exists within ATF that puts out this information. So we have a difference between a lead, a NIBIN lead, and a NIBIN hit. We're going to be analyzing NIBIN leads. And so these are kind of investigative leads that are potential hits. Right? They have high confidence correlations between the casings that have high confidence that this was the same weapon used in these different incidents. A lead doesn't become a hit until a firearms examiner or an expert confirms that these are in fact, this is in fact a hit between these incidents or multiple incidents. At least two incidents can be connected, but more can be, right? If the same gun is used in more than two, we will be linking a handful of cases together based on the same weapon that was used. Next slide. So to get into some of the analysis that we conducted and kind of present that to you, these are the jurisdictions. This is King County. The different colors show you the different law enforcement jurisdictions that we'll be examining, looking at the NIBIN leads that occurred in these jurisdictions, but also the other crime incidents and the networks of people involved in NIBIN in these jurisdictions. So you can see it's not always easy to combine data across law enforcement jurisdiction. But as you'll see in this presentation, and you probably know from your work, offenders don't know law enforcement jurisdiction. These networks of offenders move throughout jurisdiction, and we have to be able to combine the data to fully understand the networks that are operating. And so in this, we have a good data set where much of the areas where violence is occurring within King County are included, so we can have a more full picture of the network that exists. Next slide. So this is our first network, and this is going to be kind of a process of going down this rabbit hole and converting networks with more information that I'll try to explain as we go. So this is the first one. This is all the NIBIN leads from 2015 to 2017. There were 251 leads, and you can see the lead because they're yellow dots here in this sociogram in this network. 251 leads are connecting and connected to 612 incidents that we're calling NIBIN incidents because they have a NIBIN lead. So you can think of the leads here representing a gun, and that gun was used in the incidents that it's connected to, which are the blue incidents, or blue nodes. And you can see that in this network, in the top left of the network, there's lots of different connections. Right? This is one connected cluster. And you can see that a lead is connected to incidents. There might be multiple guns in that incident that were used, and so it could have multiple leads connected. And so we can see that the majority up in this big cluster of incidents that are all connected through the guns that were being used. And that's really where we're going to focus at, right? This is a highly socially connected, right? We haven't included people yet. These are just incidents that are connected through the guns, and we have this big cluster of incidents connected together. Next slide. So just looking at from the previous slide, that large cluster that was in the top left, we are just now looking at, we converted that network into just the incidents. And so this network, you see the nodes, there's only one color, are just incidents that occurred, and they're connected to each other through a common weapon. You see quite a big network, 169 incidents, all connected through the guns, the different guns that were being used in those incidents. Right. And so previously we might not know how all of these shooting incidents were connected, but NIBIN allows us to build this network of just incidents that are connected. Next slide. So we can talk about now why something might be important, or defining why a node is important within a network. And this is the idea of centrality, that certain nodes are more important than others, are more centrally located, are more influential than other nodes. This is a network of just crime incidents where we haven't even included any offenders or arrests in those incidents yet. But you can see, right, especially in this network in the center, this is the idea of degree centrality, where degree is the number of connections that you have. So degree in this case will be the number of other incidents that were connected through the guns involved in those crimes. Right? And so the dots are resized by their degree centrality, or the number of connections they have. Law enforcement is always trying to prioritize. Right? And network analysis kind of overall gives us the ability to prioritize. Right? You're looking at this network of 169 incidents where guns were used, and they're not all equal, right, in terms of their importance. You see an incident right in the middle, and Dan might be able to talk about this one a little bit later, right? But this, if my recollection is correct, was an incident, a drive-by with 4 different guns involved. And those guns all showed up at other shooting incidents. Right? And we're looking at this most central, largest dot right in the middle. Now, if previously nobody was hit, it was just some property damage, it might not be at the top of a priority list. But this information will show us that the guns that were at that shooting incident were also at other incidents. So we really need to understand the people that were using these guns in this network of incidents. So degree, number of connections to a node. Next slide. The second type of centrality, and there's many different types of centrality that you could explore and identify the ones that have practical application within your jurisdiction, the ones that tend to identify important cases or people. This is called betweenness centrality. And I've found this to be a much more strategic type of centrality, a much more strategic way of understanding who's important or what's important within a network. In this case, again, we're looking at the same 169 incidents, all connected through a NIBIN lead. so a common gun between them. And we're seeing now them resized based on their betweenness centrality. Betweenness centrality is the idea of a well-traveled intersection, right? I like to equate this to a system of streets and intersections within a city. Right? If you looked at the flow of traffic, people going from point A to point B, which intersections would they travel the most frequently? Differently, which intersections would we shut down in a city if we wanted to stop traffic or impact traffic the most? Right? Not all street intersections are equal. Some have a lot more traffic. People have to go through those intersections to get from one place to another. If we were to shut those down, we'd have the biggest impact on traffic. The same is true within the social world. Certain people act as intersections. They're connecting different parts of the network to other parts of the network. And if some people, or in this case incidents, information were to flow throughout a network, certain certain nodes would matter more. In this case, we're looking at guns, and guns are moving from incident to incident. And so we can understand which incident's the most important for the movement of guns, right? Where guns are coming together, high frequency use guns are coming together in one incident. And again, we see in the middle this most important incident where guns that are being used at a high frequency all showed up at that one incident. And this is an indication of, right, incidents are not using guns, people are using guns. And so we have to continue to build this network and show the people involved in these incidents to get a better picture of how these weapons might be moving. But just in terms of incidents, right, everyone that's getting NIBIN leads or NIBIN hits should be connecting all of them together to understand the bigger network. Too often, these NIBIN leads are just sent to the detective that's on the case, and nobody is compiling all of them for a region to see how are these all connected. And I think that's the first point. Make sure you're connecting them all at some level. Next slide. Here we can see of those 169 incidents, them ranked in order, right? And I have the first two types of centrality that I mentioned, degree and betweenness. There's a couple others, closeness and eigenvector. I just created their rank, right? Who was the most central based on that measure. And we can start to understand which incidents were most socially important within this network of shooting. Which had guns that were high frequency use. And so we have a way of then prioritizing in some way these incidents, and we can see which ones are most central that we should take a second look at and understand why is it most central. This information by itself is not that useful, right? We need to understand the network of people behind this. Next slide. And so this is the next step, right? We got all of the NIBIN data, all of the leads and incidents organized, networked. The next step is then to identify the individuals associated with those incidents. And we did that by taking 2 years of incident data from 7 jurisdictions in the county to create the network of individuals associated with these incidents. And important to understand is that these people, as I mentioned earlier, are not just involved in these NIBIN incidents. They're also involved in other crimes. And so we want to include that as well, because that will show us who they're committing crimes with and potentially who they're connected to for the flow of these guns and the consistency of violence within these networks. Next slide. I think if there was one network or one slide that would tell you what this analysis is about, it's this one. It's also a little bit confusing. So let me spend a few seconds here describing what you're seeing. So first off, we had the blue nodes, the blue dots, represent NIBIN incidents, right? That biggest cluster that we've been talking about, the 169, you can see right in the middle of this network, right? All of those blue NIBIN incidents all connected to each other. And you see going out from that, we see some green nodes, right? Those are all the people that were involved in those NIBIN incidents. And then if you go out further in this network, you see red nodes. Those are the other incidents that we're calling non-NIBIN incidents, that those people who were involved in a NIBIN incident were also involved in. All right, so again, we're building this rabbit hole, going out, connecting the information that we have. And so in this, we have 3 different colors here: NIBIN incidents, non-NIBIN incidents, and the people involved. And this is what we were really interested in seeing with this analysis. So we saw 169 previously that were connected to each other, NIBIN incidents. And in this network, we have 227, right? So we have 58 more incidents now involved or connected through the people that were involved, right? So NIBIN gives us an ability to connect incidents together. Social network analysis furthers that ability by identifying which incidents are now connected through the people involved. So this world of violence just gets smaller and smaller. And so here we've connected 227 NIBIN incidents with 444 people. Those 444 people were also involved in 763 other crimes that were not NIBIN related. So these are individuals who are embedded in extremely violent networks that we have to be understanding and paying attention to. So NIBIN incidents can be connected through the people involved, and that's why social network analysis is such an important complement to NIBIN. The next step, what we're going to do is extract out all of the people, all of these green nodes, and understand how they're connected through the crimes that they're involved in, and who might be important within this network of people. Next slide. So we've extracted out those individuals. And again, you see, as we see often in network analysis, a large cluster in the top left, and then some smaller clusters of people who are not as connected to the largest one. So we extracted out these 446 people here. And we can start to look again at how central they are. And so we're just going to look again at this top left cluster, the biggest cluster, and understand who might be important within this world of violence. Next slide. So this is that network, right? We've now narrowed it down to just people. These are people connected to each other through the crimes they've been involved in. The basis was identifying all of those NIBIN incidents. We have 359 people that are highly connected to the violent crime in the county. Each dot is a person connected to another person based on their involvement in a crime incident together. Next slide. Looking at degree centrality again, I should mention the average degree. So the average person within this network is connected to about 4.5 other people. And the dots are now resized based on how many people they're connected to. Degree centrality is not necessarily a very strategic way of looking at things. It's not that hard to be arrested with lots of other people. But this can tell you about something, right? If, for instance, if you're looking for a way to get out a message and stuff Dan is going to talk about, this gives us an idea of who's most embedded within this network of people. Right? If we were looking at the spread of disease, we would have kind of a chart of how those diseases could spread and where we would want to intervene. And we're learning, right? If you're interested in this work, please read the stuff that Papa Christos is doing. Andrew Papa Christos will show you that violence operates like a disease in the mechanisms that it flows throughout our network. Next slide. The other type of centrality betweenness that we've discussed before, we were looking at centrality among incidents. Now we're looking at it among people. You can see we have about 360 people, but when we look at this type of centrality, there's 15 or 20 that are highly central in holding this network together, right? That we might be interested in understanding what their role is within this violent network. But this tells us, right, we don't have to take on the whole network at once, but we can understand who's most influential and how can we use that information to reduce the amount of violence that's occurring, because these people are extremely vulnerable to being victims of violence, but also many of them are suspects of violence. So looking at just these people, again, next slide, we can look at their rank within this network, how influential they might be. So again, we had degree and betweenness centrality there, but there's a couple other ones, closeness and eigenvector. On the left, you see these are initials and year of birth of their pseudonyms. So not their actual information, but just for the presentation. We can start to see kind of priority of people who are most influential within this network of individuals connected to violence. This could kind of be a roadmap for intervening within this violence. Next slide. The last piece is the geographic distribution of these incidents, right? We look at a lot of geographic-based policing, hotspot policing exists. And so we went back to that 3-color network that had NIBIN, non-NIBIN incidents, and people. And of that network of people, we wanted to look at the geographic distribution of these incidents. Next slide. So first, this is the NIBIN instance, looking at that same region by census tract. You can look at, typically we would look at like all homicides or all shootings, where do they exist? But in this case, we're just looking at for that network of people, right? And so that's important, that we're looking at where networks geographically are operating, connected clusters of people, where they're operating. And you can see it moves throughout the county. It's not just in one jurisdiction. You see some concentration here kind of on the right side, but it's occurring in lots of different places. Next slide. Look at the non-NIBIN incidents. So these people that are engaged in violence or involved in violence are also committing other types of crimes, which could be significant intervention points. But we see some of that is actually a little more concentrated in this one area. And again, looking at just the incidents connected to that cluster of people, not all of the incidents that occurred. And so this geographically starts to give us kind of the framework of the idea of hot people in hot places. That gives us a roadmap for intervention. Next slide. The last thing I kind of want to show is just the top 25 most central people. Where are they committing crimes? And you can see when we lay this over the jurisdiction map, these top 25 are moving throughout the county. Right? When we look at just one network of people, most central players are active across the county, which highlights the importance of our need to build networks across jurisdictions, because it'll show us a little bit more about how these networks are operating. And I think overall this shows us socially that this is a very small world of violence if we'll connect to the data, and gives us some valuable intervention points using NIBIN, social network analysis, and GIS. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the prosecutor perspective and how we use both NIBIN and then SNA, social network analysis, in our work. Just referring back to that last slide that Andrew had up there with all the different jurisdictions, one of the big things that we do, and I'll talk about a little bit more later about the data, is really work with our law enforcement agencies to try to collect data around shots fired incidents. And NIBIN is certainly one of the data sources that we use for those shots fired incidents. But we also collect data on every shooting within those jurisdictions, just to try to get a better understanding of what firearm violence really looks like in King County. As Andrew said earlier, we have a lot of different agencies here. We have 40 different law enforcement agencies that we work with. So we, as the prosecutor's office, kind of took the lead on this project solely because we are kind of the central agency that all of these departments already work with. So we kind of used our position as being central in the criminal justice system here to be able to start collecting and standardizing some of that data so that we can really understand the problem of firearm violence before we try to address it in any way. So next slide. As Andrew talked about, I'm going to talk about some of these networks that he showed. I know Andrew used the term sociogram. I'll probably just refer to them as networks. I know some of our law enforcement partners call them the squashed spider, so you can go with that if that's what you'd prefer. So from our perspective, where do we start? I didn't give any subtitles on this slide, but really that's kind of the question that I always have coming out of these webinars. I see really interesting stuff that other people are doing, and then I just kind of think to myself, neat, but how do I do that? So that's what I'm going to talk about first. The second part is, what are the obstacles? Again, anytime we start to get into this work, walk away with the feeling of kind of, wow, this is really hard. And then the last one, how do we use it? Which is just kind of the thinking back to ourselves, wait, why are we doing this again, and what does it help us do? So with that, I'll jump into kind of where to start. So next slide. The starting point for our work, as Andrew discussed, is the data that we've collected. There are two, in terms of using NIBIN and social network analysis, there are two major data sources. First is that NIBIN lead data. This is the data that links the same gun to 2 or more shootings. Again, that's based on the forensic matching that Andrew talked about. In King County last year in 2017, as Andrew said, 250 plus NIBIN leads, over 600 NIBIN incidents. And then what's interesting for us is that kind of highlighting what Andrew talked about the mobility of crime and violence in King County and the people who are committing those offenses. About a quarter of those NIBIN leads involved incidents from more than one agency, anywhere from 2 different agencies, 3, 4, all the way up to 5 or 6 different agencies. And we also have NIBIN leads that go across county lines as well. So not just King County, but one gun will be used in King County and then again in Snohomish County or Pierce County to the north and south respectively. So very, very mobile problem here in King County. The second type of data is law enforcement data. This is the data that links 2 or more people to an incident. So as Andrew said, we used the specific data that we use from law enforcement is co-arrest data from our 7 different agencies that we are working with. This data includes things like the incident details, so the date, time, location, type of incident, and then also the person details, the name, date of birth, role type. One thing to highlight is that in collecting all of this data, this is data that law enforcement already collects. This is something that already exists, and we're not asking our agencies to generate anything new or to provide us with anything that they're not already keeping track of. So again, just taking something that we already have and using it for a different purpose. One other thing to highlight is that in the presentation today, I'm really focusing on the individuals involved in this network, both offenders and victims. Andrew gave you guys some information about looking at the incidents themselves and what we can learn from social network analysis about the incidents. For the example he gave of the most central incident, he kind of put me on the spot with that one, but that was an incident that involved, as Andrew said, it was a drive-by shooting and involved actually 7 different guns that were used in the same shooting. So it is useful to look at those incidents themselves and the network of the incidents to start thinking about how we could prioritize our investigative resources, especially when there are so many guns being used at one incident. We can also look, as Andrew said, at the geography, gives us an idea kind of the hotspots where a lot of this violence is occurring. So that's something we could develop strategies around there. But for the purpose of our presentation today, I'm really just focusing on the individuals who are involved. So next slide. So in terms of the obstacles, Andrew highlighted this and touched on it a little bit before, but with both data sets, there are some really important obstacles that we had to overcome. So with the NIBIN lead data, getting access to that data and making sure that we have all of the information about those leads was a significant hurdle. To start with, the idea of who generates the leads. So who's actually doing the matching of the casings between scenes, who's actually doing the forensic work. This is different everywhere in every jurisdiction. I know here in King County, it's our state crime lab who does that work. And so figuring out who is the one that's actually going to do that work is important. Then second, how quickly are those leads generated? Here we tend to have those leads turned around really, really quickly. Our lab does a great job with that. But that also depends a lot on the submissions. How quickly are the law enforcement agencies submitting casings to the lab for them to be able to run them through NIBIN or through IBIS and get results back. So that requires looking oftentimes at each of the different agencies that you're working with and what their protocols are in terms of collecting and processing and submitting shell casings. Then the issue of who gets the leads. Once there's a match that's been made, where does that information go? Does it go to a task force who's going to investigate those leads? Does it go to the detectives who are assigned to those cases? If there's not a detective assigned, does it go to the patrol officer who wrote up the case in the first place? If there was, it was just a shots fired incident with just casings found. Oftentimes we find that, this lead notification will go to just the various detectives, and they'll have it on their desk, and they're working hard and have a lot of cases, and we don't always see the follow-up that comes from those NIBIN leads. So really important to know who's getting them and how they're getting them. Then how do you as a prosecutor get access to those leads? Do you wait to get it from the detective on the case, or is there a way that you can work with whoever it is that's actually doing the matching or whatever task force you might have to get access to those leads so you're aware every time that a lead happens? And then finally, who analyzes the leads? Is there analysis being done looking at each of the cases that's been linked? And what kind of, in addition to the things like SNA, what other kinds of analysis can you do to try to figure out where that gun is and who's using it? So that's taken us a long time to get to a point where we now feel like we're kind of fully up to date and receiving all of the data on the NIBIN leads and be able to kind of stay connected to that information and to where we can now use it for future analysis. On the other side, the law enforcement co-arrest data, again, we're working with 7 different agencies. So each of those agencies has their own records management system. They all code and tag and define things in a different way. Doing social network analysis requires a lot of data. You need all of the co-arrest data from all of your agencies. So not only is it difficult just to get that data, you really have to sell the agencies on the importance of social network analysis and what it can do for them. But you also then, once you get that data, requires a huge amount of cleaning and standardizing, matching of names, matching of date of birth, addresses, role types. Are they a victim, witness, suspect? Do they even use that terminology? Some agencies might use subject. So all of those things require some thought and a lot of hard work to clean the data. We have an analyst in our unit, Raphael, who spends an ungodly amount of time cleaning that data, and we're deeply indebted to him for that. So that's kind of the obstacles. And once you can we've basically spent 18 months trying to get to a point where we have all of that data and where we can do this kind of analysis. So if we go to the next slide, just give an example of kind of what a typical NIBIN hit looks like in King County. And then we'll talk a little bit about how SNA can kind of help us move forward from kind of the typical example. So in this case, one gun was linked to 15 different shootings over 9 months across 3 different agencies. The number of shootings, having one gun at 15 shootings, is on the high end for our jurisdictions, but in terms of the geographic distribution and the cross-jurisdictional nature of it, it's not uncommon. This is kind of a typical pattern that we would have. Again, Andrew mentioned the offenders here in King County are very mobile, and they don't respect jurisdictional boundaries. So with this case, and with most of our NIBIN cases, what it often takes is putting together kind of a multi-agency task force, getting all of those detectives and any ATF support that we have, getting all of those folks in the room together to sit down and start talking about their leads, start talking about their cases, who's involved, what vehicles are associated, coordinate on the investigation. In this case, we were able to, as you can see there, develop PC for arrest based on some social media returns, and the gun was eventually recovered from the suspect when he was arrested on that probable cause. The interesting part about this is that we were able to, for the most part, identify who we believed had that gun, and it ended up being that person that we suspected. And that was based, again, on working together with all the different detectives on the case, and also looking at what other guns were involved in the shootings that this gun was involved in. And we kind of picked up on a pattern that people were shooting at each other, and it helped us develop suspects. Next slide. This is another kind of typical example of NIBIN work in King County. Again, one gun, 4 different shootings over 4 months involving 3 different law enforcement agencies. Again, required this kind of multi-agency task force along with federal partners to kind of work up the investigation and coordinate search warrants and things like that. In this case, again, we were able to get an idea of who we believed was in possession of that gun, and then when a search warrant was executed, the gun was actually recovered from that suspect's home. One of the great things about NIBIN is we recovered that gun about 2 months after one of the shootings. The detective was then able to, on one of the prior shootings, was then able to go back and include a picture of that suspect in a montage for the prior shooting, and ended up getting a positive pick. So not only was a gun recovered, but a second shooting was solved through that process. So that's kind of what NIBIN typically looks like, how we use it. We're now talking about how we can incorporate more of the social network analysis into how we investigate NIBIN cases. So if we go to the next slide, a couple of things that we've learned from looking at social network analysis over the last 18 months or so. First one is that a majority of shootings occur within small, identifiable networks of individuals, and that these networks contain both likely victims and likely offenders. Again, these are the networks where firearm violence concentrates. And then that we need to look at every person to understand their position in the network and their exposure to violence. Andrew touched on some of the research kind of on the contagion theory by Papachristos, and that's kind of what guided some of our work. One of the really important things to highlight is that social network analysis is not going to give you a top 10 or top 25 list of people to arrest. Andrew phrased it by saying that your network position does not equal criminality, and that's exactly right. That's the exact experience that we've had. So what it really requires is that when you have your network of individuals, you really go in and look at each individual person and understand why they're in that network and what their exposure to firearm violence is within that network. There is going to be people who are perpetrators of firearm violence and who are picking up guns and shooting them, but you'll also have people who are just extremely socially connected to people who use firearms, who otherwise may not be criminally involved. And so you really have to understand who these people are. And the benefit of that is that as prosecutors, we can identify who the people are who are actually pulling the trigger and use our have that inform our prosecutions. But we can also start to think about prevention and intervention for those people who are in the network and at a high risk of victimization, but aren't otherwise committing the shootings or picking up the guns themselves. So if we go to the next slide, Andrew, during his presentation, showed the top 25 most influential individuals in that NIBIN network. And just to break that down and kind of further underscore the point I was making about network position not equaling criminality, here's kind of who's in our top 25. 10 out of the 25 people on that list were female. In terms of age, 13 out of the 25 were under the age of 18, with an average age of just over 20. 9 of those folks had a prior firearm-related conviction. 8 of them were currently in custody. Again, underscoring that this is not a list of people to arrest. 8 of them are already sitting in custody. Victimization, 4 of those folks had been listed as either a victim or witness to a shooting in the past 3 years. And then again, underscoring the mobility issue, 11 of those 25 folks had arrests in the last 3 years in 3 or more different jurisdictions. So again, you can see from this, and I think it drives the point home, that there's no kind of single definition of what a person looks like who's in this network. You really have to look at each person individually to try to get a good sense of who they are and why they're there. So if we go to the next slide, this is an example of one of those types of people who would show up in the network, and this is kind of the active shooter. This is someone who's on the street and is a trigger puller, is willing to, one of those small group of people who's willing to pick up a gun and actually shoot it. This person is kind of in the middle of our top 25 in terms of the rankings from our social network analysis. Interestingly, this individual had no prior criminal history coming into when he started committing these shootings, so he's not necessarily someone who would have shown up on law enforcement or prosecutors' radar prior to kind of being linked through these through NIBIN and through social network analysis. But he's clearly someone who's extremely dangerous. You can see there he's involved in 2 different shootings, multiple guns used in each shootings, both on busy city streets during the middle of the day. So a very dangerous individual, and obviously there's going to be a significant kind of law enforcement and prosecution response around kind of suppression for this individual. We are prosecutors. When we see someone like this or a case like this, we're pretty good at knowing what to do with that information. So this NIBIN and SNA is a tool to help identify who's out there actually picking up the guns. But if we go to the next slide, you have kind of the flip side of it. Again, each person is in this network for a different reason. This is an example of a high-risk victim. This is a 20-year-old female. She got 1 prior attempted robbery conviction and 1 misdemeanor pending theft case. So again, not someone who's really going to show up on law enforcement's radar, but she's associated as a victim or witness in 4 separate shootings over the past 18 months in 4 different jurisdictions. And in one of those, she was actually shot and hit with a bullet. So this is an individual, again, that as prosecutors wouldn't really be someone that we were aware of, that law enforcement might not be aware of, and quite frankly that other people, social service providers and folks like that might not be aware of either. But she's clearly at a high risk of being victimized again, clearly living in this network where the firearm violence is extremely prevalent. And so as prosecutors, like I said, we know what to do with the first example, kind of that active shooter. And we're really starting to dig in now. So how can we use social network analysis, and specifically social network analysis that's derived from the NIBIN leads, derived from actual substantiated shootings? How can we use that to inform kind of prevention and intervention efforts? Once we know something about this victim, for example, what do we do with that information? How can we try to intervene and prevent this person from becoming more central in the network or becoming someone who, again, is either shot and killed or possibly even picking up a gun and using it themselves? So we don't really have the answers to that yet. This is what we're starting to look at now. What do you do with this kind of information in terms of prevention and intervention? And this is what we're going to be focused on this summer. So that's the end of our presentation here. Again, we're really focused on how do we use this data kind of on both ends to identify shooters, but also to figure out who's at risk of being shot themselves. So Aaron, I don't know if we have any questions, but that's all we have for now.
Great. Andrew, Dan, thank you both very much. Great presentation, really compelling. We have received a number of presentations. Before I get into those, I did want to let folks know that we do have this presentation available as a handout. You may have already downloaded it. Notice that it was a black and white presentation. Obviously, with all the colored dots and things like that, we wanted to make that color available to you. So we have made that color version available to you as a handout. You just have to click that v2.pdf file, and you should be able to have access to that. And the first question is, what software and I think this might be for Andrew, Dan, I'm not sure who, what software are you using to do the link analysis?
Yeah, so I use a free software called Pajek, P-A-J-E-K. There's a couple of different free softwares that you can use. There's, a lot of people are integrating social network analysis into their different analytic packages, but I tend to find it's easier when it's free. So Pajek, there's another program called Gephi, G-E-P-H-I. That's a free download that has a good online help community. There's a program, Aura, Organizational Risk Analyzer, that does cost money now, but it's a really good tool. You just pay for the license. Great tool, especially for smaller, networks under probably 500 or 1,000. Manages the data really well. And then for some people who are getting more advanced in it, there's a ton of options in R where you can produce a user interface and manage the data. I know they've been doing some of that in Philadelphia, but those are some of the software packages that the networks you saw today were all produced in Pajek.
Great. Thank you very much. And then can you talk a little bit more, how long did it take to clean the data from the jurisdictions you're working with and conduct that 2-year analysis, just approximate timelines?
Andrew,
Yeah, that's a good question. So we cleaned all of the network data first, which took I would say 3 to 4 months collecting and cleaning it. Then we worked on the NIBIN data, which probably took 3 or 4 months. Better part of a year we've been working to build these the data and clean it together. We finally got to a point where we had it all probably over the last year. To maintain it wouldn't be as challenging, but to get it all together at the beginning. And the hardest part too with combining law enforcement jurisdiction data is name cleaning and making sure people are the same people and not separate dots. So yeah, we've probably been working on this a better part of a year.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned the NIBIN data. Was that provided by the ATF or was it provided by a crime lab or some other option?
Dan?
Yeah, so that was primarily coming from both the ATF and the state crime lab who actually does the comparison. So a combination of both of those two.
Great. We did have some questions wanting a little bit more details about how you combined the data. I don't know if that's something that the limited time allows you to go into, but maybe if you could share, you just shared one critical lesson learned that linking people across the different systems, that person A correlates to person B in each one of the systems. Can you talk about any of the other data combination lessons learned that you've had?
In terms of combining data?
Exactly, yep.
Yeah, so I'll mention now, I think either previous slide or has my email address. Please, if your agencies have any questions, feel free to reach out, email me if you have kind of some of the technical questions. I'm happy to help with that. In terms of combining the data across jurisdictions, you have to just come up with a template. Almost all of this is done in Excel. Come up with a template of, okay, what variables do we want? What parameters do we want to select? Time period, crime types, role types. Do we want have everyone work off that same template to extract the data? and then you can combine it all into one, kind of basically one Excel sheet, and clean it from there once it's together, is kind of the approach we've taken. But you have lots of different challenges within the jurisdictions of, you know, there's some jurisdictions that can't extract the data from their RMS, or don't know the right fields, right? And so that's just from my experience with lots of different agencies. So coming up with a common template and working from there.
Great. In working with those other agencies, did you end up creating a formal MOU that defines roles, responsibilities, and data sharing?
Dan, you want to address MOU?
Yeah, we have with each of our partner agencies that we're working on, as well as with the ATF and the Crime Lab, we have MOUs in place about accessing the data and storing the data and sharing the data. And that was one of the kind of first components that we took on, and also was useful in kind of building out the initial relationships and trust and getting to know each other. You know, we'd worked together kind of on an individual case-by-case basis with all the different agencies that we worked with, but just kind of taking on a new, in terms of data collection, kind of a new relationship between each of the agencies. So yeah, that was one of the first things that we did.
Great. And then who is actually involved in the analysis? Is it an analyst? Is it an intel analyst or a detective? Who's actually grinding through the data once it's in the system, identifying the links and doing the follow-up?
So from my end, so this is kind of a test analysis that we were able to fund Lexi Gill, who was a graduate student through the grant that we have that primarily worked on cleaning the data and doing the analysis. But the crime strategies unit within the prosecutor's office also has an analyst they hired as part of the grant as well within the prosecutor's office that does a lot of that data cleaning and analysis work. Raphael, who works again within the prosecutor's office. So yeah, these are analysts that do the work.
Great. Before we get to some of the other questions, I did want to let folks know that we have 2 more webinars coming up on gun crime investigations. The first is on July 18th, the overlaying technologies to enhance your crime gun investigations, and October 25th, which is innovative strategies for managing firearm-related casework. You can find both of these on the Justice Clearinghouse website. If you have any problem finding them, just email me and I'll send you the link directly. So the next question that we have is from Aaron, and they ask, do you see guns with multiple NIBIN hits that get passed on to people outside of the gang friend network of particular individuals? In other words, how often do you come across guns that have been stolen or sold after they've been tied to a NIBIN hit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one of the important things to keep in mind when talking about NIBIN is that you know, NIBIN only links the gun to common incidents. It doesn't link the person to those same incidents. So quite often we see, especially within you know, the gang or group context that was referenced, we do see a lot of movement within a group of people or group or a gang of the firearms. And we have seen some examples where the gun seemingly has, just based on kind of our analysis of where the gun was used, kind of who the intended targets were perceived to be, who the suspects were, that the guns were actually moving from kind of group to group. So it's not uncommon that it does that, and something that we're always keeping in mind as we do these investigations. But in terms of quantifying it, I don't know that we could put a specific kind of number or percent on how often we see that, but it's certainly something that's always in the back of our minds.
Got it.
And if there was another database that I would add to this analysis, it's eTrace data, looking at purchasers of those guns. You might be able to track back through some of these networks of how they moved.
Got it. You know what? It's funny you say that, because that was literally the next question that was coming up, is whether you're looking at trace data for purchases, and it sounds like that's where you want to go in the coming months and years potentially.
Yeah, that would be a very valuable piece of information within these networks. It could enlighten how these guns are moving throughout these networks.
Great. And Andrew, could you, the software that you use to develop the link analysis, the free software, could you mention that again and spell it out?
Pajek, P-A-J-E-K.
So just like it sounds, not.
Yeah, just
All
like it means spider in Slovenian. Don't let the website scare you.
All right. A couple more questions and then we'll be done for today. And thank you all for very much hanging in there and answering the questions. Are the 7 jurisdictions that you're working with to gather data the most active areas in the county? From a crime perspective, I would assume.
Yes. So again, as I mentioned, we have 40 different law enforcement agencies. So when we set out to start to collect this data, we tried to focus on those jurisdictions that have the highest amount of firearm violence. We're in the work that we're doing under our grant. We're really, and it maybe came across a little bit in the presentation, really looking at firearm violence from a public health perspective in addition to a criminal justice perspective. And so we saw some of the work that our public health department here in the county had already done, and they had analyzed about 10 years worth of firearm homicide data and found that 94% of our firearm homicides came from these 7 jurisdictions over a 10-year period. So that's why we started working with these jurisdictions. We've since, to some degree, added a couple other agencies who were interested in working with us, but that was definitely our starting point, trying to figure out where can we kind of have the most bang for our buck in terms of looking at firearm violence.
Got it. Thank you. I also just received a note from Tony, and I have to apologize. The October 25th webinar is actually not on the Justice Clearinghouse site quite yet. I think we're still trying to nail down some of those details. We expect to have that in the next week or two. When we get that posted, you'll see it on the site, and we will send you we'll specifically send you an email letting you know that it's available for registration. Also, there were some questions about the availability of the recording. We will make this recording available to Ultra, and typically they will post that to their site and then let everyone know where they can download it or watch it from the Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology website. And then the last question that we have today is how much do you rely on debriefs with offenders to provide historical, familial, or hierarchical info to bolster the other data sets?
You know, that's a great question, and it's not something that we typically do here. You know, coming up with our crime strategies unit, we looked at a lot of different models around the country of how prosecutors' offices have kind of set up their systems, and that's a component of what a lot of these units have done. We don't really do that. I would direct whoever was asking that question to look at the Manhattan DA's office. They're kind of on the forefront of the crimes strategies, kind of data-driven prosecution movement. And I know they've been, I think, active since around 2011 or something like that. But I know that they do a lot of offender debriefs and have that as a very structured part of the work that they do. But it's not something that we typically do, although it may be in the future. But I can't imagine that we're going to do a ton of it.
Perfect.
And I would add on to that. I think it can add to some of these networks, finding out more information. And if anybody's interested, unless it is Milwaukee that's asking the question, Milwaukee does a great job of it. They have a report where they do some debriefs and collect some of that information. So I'd happy to put you in contact with them because they're doing a good job of it. Perfect.
Andrew, Dan, again, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us today. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. I am going to end the webinar with your emails. And so again, folks, feel free to reach out to either one of them if you have questions. And with that, again, thank you for joining us today. And everyone, please stay safe. And we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Take care, everyone. Bye now.